Well, hi, this is Mark Juergensmeyer, and I'm the convener for this wonderful series of conversations on Sikh studies. And if you have not watched the earlier conversations, first of all, shame on you. But you can watch them by going to the Sikh Foundation website where they're all recorded. And in case you wonder why I'm here, it's because Dr. Nirinjan Kaur, the founder of the Sikh Foundation, asked me to do this. And the reason for that was that Dr. Kaur was years ago, he and I formed the very first conference on Sikh studies in the United States. And it produced a book called Sikh Studies, which, Nirinjan, I think you have a copy in your hand. Well, I haven't seen one of those for a long time. But that was a product of the very first conference that we had on Sikh Studies, bring together scholars on Sikh studies from all over North America and UK and some from India. And the point was to take the temperature of the field of Sikh studies to see how it's going and what it is. And so shortly before his untimely death in December, Nirinjan called me and he said, "Mom," in his typical voice, he said, "The time has come for us to have another conference." He said, "But we can't do it in person, so let's do it on Zoom." And so he contacted people. I'm just the moderator, and he asked if I wouldn't play the same role that I played. My goodness, how many years? 35, 40 years ago in the 1970s when we had that first Sikh Studies conference. So it's been a wonderful series, and part of the fun of it is to get to know the different ways in which Sikh Studies is done and the different aspects of the Sikh culture, tradition, and community are the focus of research and interest. And today we have a particularly interesting example of this with Dr. Nirinjan Kaur Khalsa, excuse me, I've just made you an honorary Kapani. Nirinjan Kaur Khalsa, who teaches at Loyola Marymount University, just up the road from Santa Barbara, where I teach. And a colleague of my old friend, Amir Hussain, who's on the faculty there, is now the president of the American Academy of Religion. Mm. And Nirinjan does all kinds of wonderful things, and including teaching Sikh studies, and we want to find out a little bit about that. Well, I want to start, Nirinjan, with your research interest because you're interested in Sikh music, in Gurbani, and the way it's done. Well, tell me about that. Tell me what it is that you study and what are you working on now?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. And I was remembering Dr. Kapani as well when he called me, inviting me to the 50th Foundation anniversary celebration. And I think that's the first time I met you as well, Mark. It was a really beautiful conference, and the exhibit at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, that was just really wonderful. So I'm honored to be here. My interest in Sikh Kirtan really is part of my own path of being a Sikh and growing up in the Sikh community. So I was raised in the 3HO Kundalini Yoga Sikh Dharma community. And I, always had these questions about Sikh identity. And that's kind of been central, I think, to my work. And it was, I grew up in this community wearing a turban and all the way through high school. And it was in college that I started to question, who am I as a Sikh? What does my Sikh identity mean to me? And it was at this time that I started, I first went to India in 1999 for Teen Sosala, the anniversary of the Khalsa. And it was around that time I started studying with Bible Deep Singh. And he is a 13th generation exponent of the Sikh Kirtan tradition. His family has been doing Kirtan since the time of Guru Arjan Dev. He is the grandnephew of Bhai Avtar Singh and Bhai Gurcharan Singh, these well-renowned Ragis who have since passed. And the fact that the musical knowledge is intangible. It is held in memory, it's held in practice, and I was noticing these memory bearers passing away. I started studying the Geordie Pakavage, which you can see behind me, the Sikh drums. And I just fell in love with really trying to understand the Sikh Kirtan tradition. And it was so interesting to me, having been brought up a Sikh, but never having heard Kirtan played with these drums, never having heard it played with the stringed instruments, the Tanti Saj, and in Rag melody. And so, it raised a lot of questions for me. Why is it that I was unfamiliar of this huge tradition that has been nearly lost? And
when you see the ancient, artistic renderings of Guru Nanak, he always has a musician at his side. And we forget that, the slokas, the verses of the Guru Granth Sahib were meant to be sung,
yes.
And not just chanted. So, excuse me for interrupting,
No.
but I was striking me how important that is to the Sikh tradition, and good for you for recovering it. So as you were saying, you began studying.
Yeah.
What do you mean by studying it? So what is it that you looked at?
And so I'll say one thing. You make a very good point that Guru Nanak always sat with Bhai Mardana playing the rabab. And so what is the rabab? How does it sound? It has this deep, deep tone to it that's all encompassing. And imagining Guru Nanak walking and traveling and singing his message about unity beyond these man-made barriers. It's very inspiring. And so being able to hear the kirtan, hear it being sung, and how those raised within the parampara tradition, how they speak about Sikhi, where it's beyond boundaries, that really inspired me. And so my own study was first just learning simple, like opening up my voice, learning sargams, learning the rag scale, but singing wasn't my focus. Once I started playing the drums, that's like what took me. But we would have kirtan courses twice a year here in the US with Bible Deep Singh. And through those kirtan courses, it also took me to India again to study more deeply with a Pakavage Ustad, Pandit Panalalu Padhyay, and who has also since passed. And so I was studying with these elders, studying with these people who were able to share this knowledge with me. And I was encouraged to then help to document the tradition, analyze it more critically, and that brought me into Sikh Studies and my work with Professor Arvind Paul Mandir at University of Michigan. And so I went there to kind of just embark on this study. And
Professor Mandir, we're going to have a conversation with him. People think, oh, we saw these people on the poster, but that's not all. I mean, this conversation will continue. Yes. And Dr. Mandir will be one of the people we'll be talking with down the line.
Wonderful.
And by the way, since I've interrupted, I should say that if anyone who's watching this live, obviously this doesn't work if it's recording, but if you have questions, there's a Q&A section on your Zoom screen, and you can ask questions, and then at the end of our conversation, I'll take a look at those questions and we'll ask as many as we can. So anyway, that you said you were studying with studying in Michigan, and then you came into starting to teach the field of Sikh studies, not just perform in it.
That's right. Yeah. And so I'll say one thing about my research. It took me, I did a Fulbright in India through Punjabi University, which I understand you've also worked with. They have a Gurmat Sangeet department there with Dr. Gurnam Singh. And so I also worked with him. And it was interesting to see the different ways that this pre-colonial kirtan was being revived. And for me, what I started realizing was that there's been needs to codify Sikhi over time. I look at Sikh music as a lens to understand changes in Sikh identity and the reasons for it being more standardized, more codified, kind of thinking about lines of orthopraxy of what should and should not be done, and seeing how the kirtan was being lost. There were some efforts, just like the national efforts to codify the Sikh religion and say, this is who a Sikh is, this is what they look like, these are their practices. There was that effort also in the kirtan. And but problematically, when you try to codify things, things get lost. There's a lot of erasure that happens. And so my interest has been to try to kind of unravel that and open up this diversity within Sikhi that we embody ourselves. So when we sing, we embody the Bani. And
Right.
it's our own lived experience. And so it can't be bound into one exact form. And so that's kind of been my interest.
Yeah, so you just kind of passed briefly on something that I was going to ask a question about, and that is whether the music of the kirtan has changed over time, whether it's changed over time and it's changed in different places. Is the music of the kirtan in North America the same as it is in India? And is it the same everywhere? Is there only one standard musical form, or what are the variations?
Yes, it is so diverse, and that's the thing. When we think about more traditional Sikh kirtan being played with the Geordie Pakavich, the Rabab, the Taus, and being sung in Rag, and these forms, the compositions, the tradition that I learned from, they still have memory of how the compositions were sung and passed down from the Guru's times. And so being able to kind of embody that knowledge is this idea of creating what my teacher has called living books. So how do we live Sikhi? How do we embody it within ourselves? The music that we hear today, it's kind of been adapted, modified into a more simplified form so that we can there's call and response. It's more in this bhakti devotional genre vein. We have Bollywood music that's both influenced and been influenced by kirtan. And so the idea of just attuning ourselves to these different styles, I think, is what the practice is about. It's just being able to hear differently and appreciate the diversity within Sikh kirtan. So for me, it's about an evolving genre and something that we evolve within ourselves.
So part of the evolution, of course, is historical. And how do you recover these earlier musical forms, which may be lost to the contemporary audience? How do you figure out is there a way of knowing what music sounded like in Guru Nanak's time, for example?
It's such a good question. And I think this is where, my study has been in ethnography and orality and really looking at the oral traditions. And so when we talk about recovering oral traditions, we have the written word, we have the historic record, but those assets which are intangible, how do we verify them, quantify, qualify them? And they work hand in hand. And so for me, it's been working with those memory bearers. So I went around India during my Fulbright. I interviewed as many people as I could, many who have since passed away, trying to recover this knowledge. And this has been the work of my teacher, Baldeep Singh. This has been my work, the work of Dr. Francesca Cassio at Hofstra University. She's the chair of Sikh musicology there. Our efforts are to help to revive and preserve some of that oral knowledge. And for me, the way that it can be vetted or verified is just through experiencing it, through attuning ourselves to how do we see, what are we looking for? How do we sift the knowledge? And so what's been written down in notation, it has a purpose, but it's not everything. You can't express musicality only in notation. And so things get lost that way. And so being able to have notation and recordings along with the memory passing along is a big part of that work.
So could you give us an example of something that has changed and the way in which some of the original sounds and music has evolved?
Yeah, so now, we're used to hearing Gurbani Kirtan being played with the harmonium and with the tabla.
Right.
It's usually not in rag form, it's more simplified. There is a desire to have more call and response so that the Sangit can also sing. But part of kirtan is also listening and having those who, it is a little bit more of a classical music style in the Drupad form. So some forms are very slow and meditative and contemplative. And so it just kind of takes on a different shape altogether. And there's many examples like on YouTube of, if you want to check out people like by Baldeep Singh, by Avtar Singh, by Gurcharan Singh singing, they offer good examples.
And do you sing also?
Not quite. I sing along because I'm an accompanist. I play the percussion, I play the drums. I sing along.
Well, I have a zillion other questions about the music, but I'm sure other people have them also. I want to move on and talk about other aspects of what you're doing, because you not only practice kirtan, but you also study it and teach about it. So you teach a course in Sikh Studies, and had there ever been a course in Sikh Studies at Loyola Marymount?
Not a full course on Sikh Studies. So we do have a world religions class. I teach in the Department of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University. And our university is unique. It's a Catholic Jesuit university. And so it's a private university. And the theology classes, everyone that goes to the university has to take 2 theology classes. So all of our classes, people are very interested in Sikhism. It's something that they may not be familiar with. We don't have very many Sikh students on campus. Currently, I am the faculty advisor for our Sikh Student Association, which we just started this past year. There may have been one in the past, but I've been at this university for 6 years, so I'm not as familiar with what has been there. I usually have about 1 or 2 Sikh students in my classes a year. So we have a small Sikh population at LMU. The university has about 10,000 students, about 6,500 of those are undergrad, and then it has a graduate program as well. So it's interesting because I get students from all colleges, from science, business, filmmaking, film and television, and the liberal arts. So trying to kind of share Sikhi with all of them has been a fun process. And coming from Michigan, then to LMU, it's been fun for me to also think about engagement. So part of the classes have engaged learning. So it's a lot about when we think about theology, it's about our commitments. What commitments what are these theological commitments that people make? So when we think about Guru Nanak and that commitment to oneness, to service, to meditation, to really like using our discerning faculties in the world, this is what I try to bring to students. So the Jesuit tradition has these spiritual exercises, and they talk about being men and women for others. They talk about finding God in all things. And so I have a really unique way of being able to kind of speak to the Jesuit practices and also have students do some Sikh-related practices. So they'll do seva, we'll go to the Gurdwara. There's a food truck that feeds the homeless around Los Angeles, and they'll go do seva with them, the Khalsa Peace Corps. We'll go to Gurdwara.
What's the Khalsa Peace Corps?
It's a food truck that goes around to different parts of Los Angeles, to Venice, to Skid Row, and they make burritos and they serve them.
So it's a lunger on wheels.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And so the students are really able to engage with, what does it mean to actually live these teachings? What does it mean to enact these practices in your daily life? And I feel like there's flexibility to really focus on practice. Some of the students will do like a meditation practice. Right now is the season of Lent. And so during the season of Lent, I encourage them to do like a 40-day challenge. and they can practice, non-attachment, maybe giving up something that doesn't serve them, or service or meditation. And so we have these different ways that students can participate. I think one of the big things is the Baisakhi at the LA Convention Center that we have every year. Not now during COVID, but usually students can go there and they're able to serve and just see this really large gathering of Sikhs throughout all of Southern California.
Oh, thousands and thousands, right? I mean, it's a huge gathering.
Yeah.
So this is interesting because usually when academics like me present any religious tradition, including the Sikh tradition, they do it historically.
Yeah.
And they start at the beginning and they spend a lot of time talking about the gurus and then the growth of the tradition and Ranjit Singh and so forth. And then, they may also talk a little bit about the theology, the ideas and so forth. But they probably almost never or very seldom, and I think I'm an exception to this case because I also take my students to the Gurdwara. We don't just sit in the classroom. I want them to actually get the experience. But it seems to me that that's what you do, that you want to introduce students to the practice and the experience of Sikhi and not just the history and the tradition. I assume you have some history. I mean, at least they come out and know who the gurus are, right?
Yes. Yeah, we go through, so it is kind of an overview class. So definitely we go through Sikh history. We talk about, we also center it in current events of what's happening now. So thinking about hate crimes against Sikhs, which continually are sadly happening. The Sikh Student Association is, spreading awareness about the farmers' protest, and I've been letting students in class.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. The sound movement. Yeah.
Exactly, and we talk about what it means to be a warrior saint, to stand up and fight for what you believe in, what is right, through an ethic of, through a saint's eyes. How does a saint see? Through meditation, through seeing everyone as one, that everyone should have access to equality, to their own sovereignty while caring for others. So we kind of talk about the theologies like embedded into different practices that we do in the course, but it's definitely through the lens of Sikh history, philosophy, and then that theological angle, and then also thinking about really critiquing what happened during colonization, because we're at a Catholic institution, so we have to talk about how Christianity has informed how religion is even discussed these days. So I start with thinking about worldviews. How do we see the world? What shapes how we our perspectives that we have in our world? And it's our background, it's our religious upbringing. And so being able to see how those kind of shape what we do, it's moving through that and being able to kind of then unravel. Because it's a lot of unraveling work we have to do to decolonize Sikhi. And so it's a lot of that work that's being done through then the engagement.
Yeah, it sounds like to me that you are taking the challenge of students who are a student body that is largely non-Sikh. And probably doesn't know beans about it, and they grew up Catholic or some other form of Christianity, if they're practicing at all. Of course, these days, a lot of students kind of, give lip service at best to their religious affiliation, and you try to get them out of that box and get them into a sense of other traditions and seeing the world through other eyes and through the different kinds of eyes, the different ways in which religion can be seen, because it's not all the same. And you're absolutely right that even scholars have a bad habit of taking Christianity as the template of religion, and then looking around the world for other forms of what we think of as religion molded by our image of Christianity. It doesn't work that way, because the way religion develops and is related to culture and related to human experience is different in different traditions. So what a great thing to do. And to do that, not didactically, way, we professors sometimes do, but to try to do it experientially, to try to bring people along in a way that they can see this difference.
Yeah.
So good for you. Do students like your courses?
They do. Yes.
I'd like to take it. It sounds like fun to me.
Yes. Yeah. I get really wonderful responses. I try to make it also just that it can really help students. They're all very stressed right now. There's a lot of depression, feelings of isolation, especially now during COVID, and trying to give them tools. And that's what religious traditions, they ultimately offer these tools for how we can move through the world. And so we also talk about it in the frame of thinking about, there's an emeritus professor at our university, James Fredericks, who wrote a book about comparative theology. But he talks about doing it comparatively, that it's not about, there's different religious perspectives that may be exclusivist or maybe inclusivist. But we know the issue with inclusivism is like assuming like everybody should kind of fit one fold. We have these ideas about pluralism, but actually doing theology is about deepening your own perspective, your own belief system through engagement with others. And so I think students find that really valuable. I'm also teaching Valerie Carr's book right now. It's called See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. And so she's a Sikh activist woman. She started her work after 9/11, and she has practices that help you move through individual and community, pain and oppression and these issues of hate that we have in the world. How do we move through that? And I think giving students tools to listen to one another, be empathetic, be able to grieve with one another, and really try to recognize the issues that communities are facing and want to do something about it. So it's also, LMU is focused on social justice, it's service and social justice. And so really taking that social justice framework has been a focus of mine.
Well, that's just perfect for SEVA, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
So, do students ever ask you what your faith is? I mean, professors often like to just try to be objective and distance themselves, but students are, particularly on a subject like religion, students are trying to figure out your perspective and where you're coming from. And of course, since you wear a turban, you can't really hide it.
Yeah.
So do you talk about yourself at all?
I do. So yes, I have realized, and through my own work, I'm working on, my first book project, thinking about it as an autoethnography. So being able to talk about ourselves to help share our stories with others so they can understand has been a focus now. So I start, and because LMU, we're in a theological studies department, I start right off the bat saying, this is me, this is how I grew up in this predominantly white Sikh community. We wore white, our last name is Khalsa. We were told to practice it in this particular way because my parents became Sikhs in their 20s. And so our parents' generation really found they wanted to do Sikhi right. They wanted to embody it for themselves, this beautiful path that they had found. But what happens is it started to, it can be a little bit fundamentalist when you first start a new religion and you're trying to teach it to your kids and there's only one way to do it. And a lot of kids that grew up as second generation like me, we found some hypocrisy there with the ways that it is being taught to us and then the ways that like the ideology, the theology, the religion, Guru Nanak's vision being shared with us, and then the ways that it's practiced. And so being able to talk about my own experience really gives an opening to think about how Sikhi has traveled into the diaspora, into now it's different cultures, languages, ethnicities. I mean, we have like this opening of Sikhi and really talking about what Sikh identity is then and being able to problematize it then through those angles.
So you've always been a Sikh. You were born into the community, and you've always had the name Khalsa. You've never known another name, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So, are you still in contact with the 3HO community, or has the community kind of morphed into the broader Sikh community?
That's a great question. Recently it's been really hard because it came out that the spiritual teacher, there is cases of sexual abuse, which opened up cases of abuse across the board. As we know, sadly, these cases of abuse aren't new in small religious communities, in yoga communities. I'm just about to publish a paper on this topic that came out of a conference we did at LMU on abuse in various communities, and the Catholic community has it as well. And so thinking about, I've been interested in Sikh feminisms and thinking about power dynamics, particularly because me playing the Geordie as a Sikh woman, right now I don't have access to be able to play at the Golden Temple because it has been, there's a barrier there to women being able to play, and in various ways as well. You mentioned by Mardana playing the Rabab, and they say only Amritdhari Sikhs are allowed to play the Golden Temple now, where there has been a long history of Muslim Rababis being able to play kirtan. And so there's a lot of these just kind of interesting power dynamics and questions. And so I'm involved in the 3HO Sikh community. I'm interested in really helping to answer, I think, questions that people have now about, kind of trying to parse apart what is Sikhi, what's the yoga practice, questions about appropriation, questions about whiteness, all of these things that kind of, these power dynamics that start to become involved when you think about Sikhi as it travels through different places.
Have you ever been challenged by people who think either for gender or ethnicity or for whatever reason that you shouldn't be doing the things you're doing?
Yes, in different ways. But overall, I think that there's been, it's interesting. So I've studied, I'm trying to figure out where to take this because I've studied Punjabi, but I don't speak Punjabi. So I can understand.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think it's an important question. So just kind of where we fit. And so every Sikh that I've come into contact with, they're unique. They have their own perspective, their own way that they understand and interpret Sikhi. So overall, I feel like I have received a lot of more positive affirmation about being a Sikh, but it's also hard because when I do show up with my turban, I get a lot of people feeling like, oh, you're doing Sikhi right, and I'm not a great Sikh. And that whole dynamic is very problematic to me. Yeah. Because what is the right way to be a Sikh? I think that's a huge question. And then being a woman, there's a lot of experiences that you have about how you should dress and what you should look like, how you should act, and all of those things that kind of become involved. But a lot of the kids that grew up in our community, they went to school in India. They went to school in the UP, in Dehradun, in Mussoorie, and in Amritsar. And so for them, just being able to really be embedded into Punjabi culture, being able to speak the language, that has been something that I think really has helped to transform our own 3HO Sikh community from the inside, because it really expands it and it allows people to see that there's so many different ways to connect with Sikhi.
So that brings us back to the central topic of this whole series and the question that I ask every person in the conversations that we've been having, and that is the field of Sikh Studies. How do you define Sikh Studies? Because, when I first started, confronted the Sikh tradition and the people who studied it, it was all about history and tradition. And the early days, particularly the lives of the gurus and so forth, if you wanted to true Sikh studies scholarship was always grounded in this kind of scriptural and historical background. But what I'm discovering in all these conversations, including the one with you, is there's so much diversity now. And do you see it that way too? Do you see yourself at the periphery of Sikh studies, or do you feel that you are, fully engaged with Sikh studies?
Yeah, I think because I did my I feel fully engaged in the field of Sikh studies. I think what Sikh studies is it just what it is to be a Sikh is what it is to be a person in the world, and how those connect with one another, how they encounter one another, those intersections. These are all things that I find kind of central. So Sikhi can travel into different spaces, and we can study Sikhi through multiple lenses. So my work at University of Michigan, kind of being in this more Sikh studies field and being trained in that way, and doing the Sikh Kirtan, and now teaching in a theology and a religious studies department, right? Theology department really does, make me feel kind of at the center of Sikh studies, which is diverse. So I guess kind of the idea of today is this diversity. And and I didn't mention that I came into LMU teaching both Sikhism and Jainism. So it was this position that was created by the Sikh and Jain communities, based on this friendship by Dr. Sahota and Dr. Sulek Jain. And they wanted to bring these two traditions together. And we might think of them as really disparate, like Jain being one of the oldest and Sikhi being one of the newest, and Jains being all about nonviolence or ahimsa, and Sikhs having that warrior background. But what was so fun is I was able to organize conferences. We had one on music and poetics. The papers from that conference were just published in Sikh Formations Journal. And we also had one about spiritual warriors. So what does it mean to live in the world and battle our own vices, battle our own demons and the kam, krodh, lobh, moh, ahankar? Like, what does that look like for Sikhs and for Jains? And ultimately, Jainism is about letting others live, and Sikhs are about helping others to live. So just kind of being in Sikh studies, but being able to look at it through these multiple lenses within this Jesuit institution has been really interesting for me. And it's really allowed me to grow and stretch my wheelhouse.
Well, oh, great. That's a good answer. And it's really interesting to get a picture of what you're doing, both in your research and in your teaching and in your life.
Yeah.
We have some questions. And so if you don't mind, we'll turn to some of those. I don't know where to start. Simran Singh says that it's a fantastic conversation, and largely thanks to you, Nirinjan, and wants to know what values the kind of work that you do in Sikh studies has for the larger community. I assume he means the Sikh community. Your students are mostly non-Sikhs, but the question is, in what way can everyday practitioners in the wider Sikh community benefit from Sikh scholarship, including the kind of work that you do?
Great question. Thank you, Simran.
Yeah.
So learning anything, you are able to really delve into it, deeply. And being able to then go into Sikh studies gives a lens and allows it develops a critical faculty through which to understand Sikh practice, Sikh history over time. And so what the value of Sikh studies is for the larger community is that it allows for a deep interrogation. And so for me, Sikhi, is rooted in this idea of nirbhav, of being fearless, and that it is open to all sorts of questioning, that it stands up on its own, that it's a unique, distinct, sovereign tradition that can move into multiple spaces. And so being able to use like a critical lens through which to see how changes have happened over time, the reasons for those changes, whether they're beneficial or not, and whether institutions that we have still serve the Sikh community. I think these are all really integral questions, and that each Sikh, embodies it in their own unique, particular way, is always really important. So whenever we're having conversations and dialogues with scholarship and the Sikh community, we have to remember it's always a dialogue. It's always a conversation. And so there's never one exact right answer, but there's ways through which we can understand and look at whatever topic we're discussing. And so I really appreciate it, being a Sikh and really being able to delve really deeply into whatever topic that I find is really fascinating.
Yeah, Professor Hawley from Calgary has a opposite question. That is, since most of your students are non-Sikhs, what challenges does this present to you in trying to present the tradition? You talked a little bit about that, but can you say something more?
Yeah. So I came to LMU out of grad school. So I'm still a new professor, 6 years into this position. And I've only had primarily non-Sikh students. And so I feel like being able to share, starting with worldview, starting with how we see the world, how Sikhs see the world through the lens of Guru Nanak, reading Japji, we go through Japji, we go through some other of the Bani, and being able to kind of unpack that, that philosophy that's contained in it, helps then to, and talking about like current events and having people really see the hate crimes that have happened against Sikhs because of their turban, where within Sikh history, Sikhs have always been about standing up for justice and for freedom of religion. They're able to really connect with it in both a way that's like, awareness of what's happening now in modern times, social justice, as well as thinking about the vision of Guru Nanak and how we can understand that today. And so I feel like that angle has really helped kind of share Sikhi with students and allow the Sikh students that I do have to really kind of feel firmly embedded in their own belief system as well.
A question that sort of related, and it's a question of how we can overcome the misunderstandings and barriers that have been created by some of the Indic traditions. I'm trying to think what they have in mind. I guess you can use your own imagination, sometimes politically motivated, that cause obstacles in the study of Sikhism. Do you see that as an issue?
I'm reading it also.
I'm trying to think precisely what they have in mind, whether it's it seemed to imply that there has been a kind of bias against Sikhism in a way that I guess by the broader Hindu community or by the BJP, and I don't, since I don't know specifically what they have in mind, I don't quite know how to ask the question.
Yeah.
Does this ring any bells to you, or?
I mean, I think having to, it's always hard, and I get emotional having to talk about the violence that's been incurred against the Sikh community. And that still happens now. And today it's hard. I cry every time. I'm sorry. It's real, and it has been the history of Sikhi. It's been embedded into this history of violence, and particularly with the creation then of the Indian state and partition, and how Sikhs have been pigeonholed into this religious minority and not being able to have a voice or access, and being labeled both in India and the US as terrorists. These are all real issues that I think are essential to address. And so I, in my own way, address them in the course. And, since the summer, with everything, this awakening that's been happening in our country around racism, I've really been also, I think, interrogating my own whiteness and thinking about, who I am as a Sikh. I have personally was not brought up with in a Punjabi family. With Punjab politics in India is central to my life, though they're central to my Sikh identity. And
Right.
so I think that there's a way that I'm realizing that I kind of perhaps can bridge some of these things for students, and kind of help to translate Sikhi through my own lens, growing up in America. My mother's father was a Christian preacher. I kind of am able, I think, to share this information through my own lens, and then help them to see, these problems that have happened within the Sikh community over time, and hopefully trying to find ways that we can address them as well.
Well, this brings up then another question that Gurdas Hadwal has asked. How can we overcome a Punjab-centric view of Sikhism so that it becomes more inclusive of all non-Punjabi Sikhs, not only from other parts of the world, but other parts of India? He was thinking in particular about Sikhs in Northeast India who tend to be overlooked because they're not in the Punjab. Is there a kind of Punjab centrism that somehow the tradition needs to overcome?
It did start in the Punjab. Sadly, the Punjab was partitioned, and so much was lost during that time, including a lot of the Muslim Rababis were kept in Pakistan, and a lot of that knowledge was then remained there. And there's this need, because of this pigeonholing of the Sikh community, there was a need for Sikhs to codify themselves and create these standards of who we are, and create a really cohesive identity as a community. But Sikhism, or Sikhs, continue to travel throughout the world, and they've gone to Africa, Australia, the US. Now with the community that I was raised in, so many people are becoming Sikhs from a lot of different nationalities, South America and China and throughout Europe. And so I think it's through, Sikhi is still relatively a young religious tradition. And so these changes over time help that evolution happen. And evolution, I don't mean on a hierarchical scale in any way, but just change and develop and expand. Maybe I'll use the word expand. So Sikhi continues to expand. And I think through its own expansion, then we're confronted with these questions about, is Punjab central to Sikh identity? And what is Sikhi? And so these are the questions that I find fascinating, and that I'm also trying to interrogate within my own work.
Yeah, I have to admit, I find personally I'm a little conflicted about this question, because I've lived in the Punjab for a while. I taught at Punjab University. I love the Punjab. Yeah. and I love it for various reasons. And one of them is, I think it's a wonderful model for global culture, because pre-partition Punjab especially was this wonderful multicultural vessel with so many different cultures interacting, and you can see that in the history of the Sikh tradition. Just look at the Guru Granth Sahib and all of the different voices that have come together from different religious backgrounds that are part of this sacred scripture. What other religious tradition has this kind of amalgam of different voices in it? And I think it's because of that rich heritage of the Punjab. So at least in my in my thinking, I hope that Sikhism never loses a sense of the Punjab in that sense, in the embracing of multiculturalism and the ability of people from different backgrounds to live together at the same time that one gives dignity and respect for the tradition that one is central to one's life. But that's me.
Thank you for that. I think that was so beautifully said, because keeping the heart, of Sikhi, and allowing that to be central, as well as seeing how it can expand from there is, yeah, it's beautiful.
Here's an interesting question from somebody who I take it does not have an Indian background, who says that they practice kirtan, but not in the traditional rag, and in part because they don't quite understand the words, but at the same time, the person says, I simply enjoy singing my own melodies with the guru's language. And then there's a kind of guilt there saying, am I continuing a colonial distortion? Or is there room in the parampara for someone like me and my music?
Oh, beautiful question.
Isn't that a nice question?
Yes. Yes, there's space for, so that's been my impetus, is there's space for everyone, but let's not lose. So I think it goes back to what you were just talking about with Punjab and Punjabi culture and the language, is what gets erased along the way is something that we have to look at. What's being lost? So there is space for everybody to sing Gurbani in whatever way they choose. I personally think that what is central, though, is to also remember where it came from and what was in the past. And so as long as we're not losing or distorting how it was done, then we can also be creative. I mean, the whole point of Gurbani is to embody the Bani and create and have it be this dynamic, expressive experience that we have for ourselves. So I don't think it limits any type of creativity or innovation, but it allows for it as long as we're also, kind of keeping the memory, the knowledge, the roots also alive.
And we have a couple of questions about what you teach in the academic program. Kulvinder Singh is particularly interested in teaching Jainism alongside of Sikhism, and kind of wonders how you did it, and whether you find the Jain students how they feel about Sikhism and vice versa. And do you take them to a Jain temple? Is there one in LA and Southern California?
There is. We're very lucky in Los Angeles that we have.
Los Angeles, the whole world is in Los Angeles. I take my students to LA to all the different places. You're right.
Yes. Yeah, we have many gurdwaras here. And then also the Jain Center of Southern California is just about 45 minutes away in Buena Park, and take students there as well. So it's a good question, because I didn't teach Sikhism and Jainism in the exact same course. Though when I taught, I had distinct courses for each of those. But I also teach some intro level courses, and we have these open-ended courses called In Search of a Way, or God in the Human Experience. And so these courses allow me to bring in different ways of seeing and being in the world. And so in those courses, I am able to talk about the Jain vows, the 5 vows of non-stealing, non-attachment, non-violence, truth, and moderation, or brahmacharya. And so looking at those, and then looking at Sikh values of seva, simran, really allows, and how do we go beyond our own ego-centered minds and ways of being? It allows Sikhs to it allows students, to interact with both traditions in interesting ways. And so we're able to talk about cosmology, the ideas of how the world works, and how afterlife and karma work. And so for me, I am somebody that's interested in similarities and distinctness. So trying to find ways through that. And it's really through the conferences that we held on spiritual warriors and the music and poetics that we were really able to kind of engage the traditions together in very unique and interesting ways. And, the Sikhs and the Jains, they don't believe in the caste system. That has been at least something that's part of the belief system. And there was an interesting thing when I went to Patna Sahib for Guru Gobind Singh's 350th birthday. And there's a Jain mandir right next to the Sri Takht Harmandir Sahib. And there's just a wall that separates them. And what I found was that it was actually a Jain family that cared for Guru Tegh Bahadur and Gobind Rai then, his son and the family. During that time, they gave the land to the Takht, where the Takht and the Dharamsala were built. And it's this Jain mandir that was part of that family that still stands. So there's been really interesting kind of ways for me to see that there's been actually a mutualism, and
there's been more of a connection than we thought.
Yes. So that was, and I just love the Jain community. And for me to learn about Jainism as I was teaching it really expanded my own understanding of Sikhi, because it has very deep, intricate understandings of how karma works, ideas about nonviolence, ideas about, just really about practice. And so being able to interrogate those through my own understanding of Sikhi was transformative for me also.
Yeah, and Sikhism is not a violent tradition. That image should be erased almost immediately. It is as nonviolent at its heart as Jainism is, and
Yes.
the only sword comes in is defense for the faith, which is
Indeed.
every religious tradition allows for that. So I don't see Sikhism as really any different in that regard. And to see those connections, the nonviolent connections between the two traditions, I think is totally appropriate.
Yeah.
So the last question we have time for comes back to our participant who is concerned about performing the kirtan. And so the question is about the Drupad tradition. And the observation is that it's so slow and meditative. And some of the traditional kirtan seems more masculine. And the question is whether you think of the Drupad as somehow more feminine, or do you even think in those terms? It's an interesting question. I'd really thought of music in terms of gender, but it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, it is. It is. And thank you, Guer. I see you. Hi. We know each other.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and she's a beautiful musician.
Yeah, I thought Guer was a woman's name, but I tried to avoid, just in case I was wrong. I didn't want to make a mistake.
I think it's a great question. I mean, for me, it was interesting. Bible Deep Singh named me as the first female exponent of the Geordie Pakavage, of the Sikh drumming tradition. And so a big question for me has been, like, why have there not been women before? And recognizing that women always played kirtan. They've always been involved, but not in the professional way, not performing on stages. Women were always given different roles, and being upfront in that way was not part of that history. And so it has been a male-dominated tradition. And so for me, it's been very, very interesting to try to understand it as a female through that lens, not having a lot of other female Pakavage, or Geordie players more to really look up to of how is this done. And I think that that's part of the work now, is just trying to see how we can understand it through a female lens. Drupad itself, I find also very meditative. And now that I've studied it, it's what really gets me into that meditative space, and really speaks to my heart. But I understand the thought that it's more masculine and more of this male practice, because it's been, it has been a male dominated genre. So, but there are many women that sing it. And I think that Dr. Francesca Cassio is a beautiful example, because she has studied in the tradition. She is a beautiful musician as well as a scholar. And so being able to hear her renditions, as well as there's many others now, I think that's starting to open it up and give that female voice to something that's been more male dominated in the past.
So, Nirinjan, this brings up a question of my own. Every religious tradition has a sorry past of patriarchal kind of dominance, and that's changing happily. and much for the better, because it enriches the practice and the knowledge of the tradition. And you see this changing in Sikhism too, I take it. Are there still obstacles, and there are still transformations yet to occur?
So much. I think the hard thing with Sikhism is because there's been so many attacks from the outside, that there's been this desire to really protect the Sikh community and keep it, you know, safe. And it's been hard, I think, then to look from within and unpack all that messiness of that we maybe aren't actually living what the gurus teach. Maybe we're not actually living that equality that we speak about. And so for me, looking at Sikh Kirtan as that angle and that lens to see how women, you know, performing even in Gurdwara, they're maybe told up to cover up more, they'll turn their mic down, or they'll have them positioned away from the Sangat because there's this concern that women are going to be alluring or something when they're in Gurdwara singing. So there's a lot of just issues with patriarchy that do have to be addressed. And I think that that is part of, you know, the work that many are doing right now, is to look at it, name it, be able to uproot those things that just no longer serve the Sikh community. So just because something has always been done a particular way, it doesn't mean that it can't change. So just because women have never been allowed to play inside of Darbar Sahib at the Golden Temple doesn't mean that it should be excluded forever. And so this has been part of my interest in looking at that.
Right. Yeah, Rupan Kaur wants to know how she, even though she has an engineering background, how she can study Sikh studies in British Columbia. Rupan, go to the University of British Columbia. UBC has had a proud tradition of Sikh studies for some years, and I'm sure they would be glad to advise you and welcome you. We don't have time really for more questions. We can just go on forever, Nirinjan. And I hope that if people want to contact you, that's okay.
Yep.
I think we have an email address for you. It's just Nirinjan at lmu.edu.
Nirinjan.Khalsa@lmu.edu. Yeah.
Pretty straightforward. Well, this has been such a pleasure. And you've so enriched our understanding what Sikh Studies is by your work and by your teaching. And it's such a pleasure to have you as a part of this conversation. And my congratulations to you for all that you've done. And I look forward to even greater things to come.
Thank you, Mark. This has been really wonderful. I'm so glad I could share with everyone here. And thank you all for tuning in.
Great. Well, bye-bye.
Bye.